There comes a moment in every soul's journey when the familiar ceases to fit. Like a coat once worn proudly, the life you built begins to feel tight in the shoulders and threadbare at the seams. And yet, you wear it still, out of habit, out of comfort, out of fear. Until one day something cracks open, something small, something subtle. A glance from a stranger that feels like a mirror. A dream that lingers like smoke. A strange peace in the midst of chaos. And in that moment, a whisper stirs within. You were meant for more than this. There is a strange quietness that precedes transformation. Not the absence of noise in the outer world, but a stillness that rises from within, uninvited, unexplainable, and often deeply uncomfortable. This stillness is not sought. It seeks you. And when it does, many recoil. They mistake it for depression, alienation, or some flaw in themselves. But what if this sudden desire to withdraw, to step away from the clamor of life, was not regression, but a sacred summons? The soul, when nearing a threshold of growth, often first demands separation, not to escape others, but to recover oneself. In the beginning, it can feel confusing. People you once laughed with no longer stir joy in you. Conversations that once gave you a sense of belonging now ring hollow. You show up at social gatherings and find yourself drifting, watching, pretending. You begin to feel like a stranger in your own skin, in your own life. And this discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that something old in you is dying. There is a reason that sages, mystics, prophets, and seers have across cultures and centuries all undergone a period of deep solitude before stepping into their purpose. It is not because they hated the world. It is because they needed to shed the world's noise to hear the deeper sound of their own being. The clamor of collective identity must be silenced for the whisper of the soul to be heard. And that whisper, that trembling voice buried beneath years of expectations, fears, and masks, is the truest voice you will ever encounter. But it does not shout. It only speaks in the presence of silence. A woman I once knew was the center of every room she entered. She had charm, wit, beauty, success, everything the world celebrates. Yet one day, seemingly out of nowhere, she quit her job, ended a long-term relationship, and moved to a small house by the woods. Friends were confused. Some even accused her of having a breakdown. But she was not breaking down. She was breaking open. In the stillness of her new life, she began to write. Not for money or approval, but because it poured out of her like a river long dammed. And in her writing, she found truths that she never knew she carried. Strangers read her work and wept, not because her words were perfect, but because they were real. She became a vessel, not through ambition, but through surrender. And it all began with solitude. Solitude, when chosen from the soul rather than imposed by circumstance, is not loneliness. It is intimacy of the highest order. It is the space where the self meets the self, where the mask slips and the mirror is no longer clouded. In this space, we begin to see what we have avoided, the wounds we've buried, the truths we've suppressed, the parts of ourselves we learned to disown in order to survive. But with seeing comes healing. The silence becomes less threatening. It becomes a sanctuary. Still, this journey is not for the faint of heart. It is not glamorous. It is not Instagrammable. There are days when the quiet feels like a weight pressing on your chest. Days when the world feels like it is moving on without you. Days when you wonder if you are making a terrible mistake by stepping away from the noise, but in those moments, look closer, feel deeper. Beneath the ache, there is something stirring, something ancient, sacred, and deeply alive. This pulling away is not permanent isolation. It is gestation. Just as a seed must be buried in darkness before it can bloom, so too must the soul retreat before it can rise. The withdrawal is not the end of your contribution to the world. It is the beginning of a new one, a more conscious, more aligned, more powerful one. You are not being asked to reject the world. You are being asked to meet it anew, from your center, not your conditioning. Many fear this solitude because it strips away distraction. It leaves us face to face with our emptiness, our longing, our unhealed wounds. But what if that emptiness was sacred? What if it was the womb of all creativity, all insight, all rebirth? In the absence of noise, we begin to notice the small things again. The way sunlight lands on the floor, the quiet wisdom of trees, the sound of our own breath. We begin to see beauty not as an external performance, but as a presence we carry within. We remember who we were before the world told us who to be. And then something subtle begins to shift. Others begin to feel it too. Without trying, without speaking, without performing, your presence begins to affect people. They feel calmer around you. They feel seen. Not because you are trying to save them, but because you have saved something in yourself. You have reclaimed your authenticity, and that is more magnetic than anything you could ever say. You become, in a sense, a quiet lighthouse. Not loud, not imposing, but radiant. And people who are lost, even if they do not understand, why begin to find their way toward you. Your solitude, once mistaken for retreat, becomes your offering. It becomes the very ground from which you serve, create, and connect, not from need but from wholeness. So if you feel the urge to withdraw, to go inward, to simplify, do not rush to label it as a problem to fix. It may be the most honest part of you asking for attention. It may be the sacred beginning of something far greater than you imagined. Trust the quiet. Trust the pulling away. Trust the ache that leads you home. For in that solitude, you are not losing the world. You are finding your place in it. There comes a moment in life when you look around and no longer recognize the faces that surround you, not because they have changed, but because you have. The jokes that once made you laugh now seem hollow. The games people play no longer amuse you. You begin to sense an invisible veil separating you from the world you used to inhabit with ease. This shift is not arrogance. It is not disconnection. It is the beginning of awakening. One of the most painful yet undeniable signs that you are stepping into a role greater than you imagined is the realization that your current environment cannot contain your emerging self. It's like trying to pour a rising tide into a thimble. Something begins to crack. Your energy no longer fits the conversations. Your thoughts no longer reflect the beliefs of those around you. What once felt like home now feels like confinement. This shift doesn't always arrive with fireworks or grand revelations. Often it begins with a whisper, a subtle discomfort, a flicker of inner resistance. You attend the same gatherings, meet with the same people, engage in the same routines, and yet you feel like a ghost passing through a world that no longer mirrors who you are becoming. This experience is both disorienting and deeply sacred. It marks the threshold between the life you've known and the one calling to you beyond the familiar. People rarely talk about the loneliness that comes with growth. There is this assumption that evolving into a higher version of yourself will be celebrated. But more often than not, it is misunderstood. Your silence is misinterpreted as distance. Your introspection is mistaken for judgment. Those who once loved you may now question you, not because they no longer care, but because they can't follow you where you are going. A man I once spoke with described the moment he knew he had outgrown his environment. He had spent years in corporate leadership, built wealth, earned recognition. Yet every time he returned home from work, he felt depleted. Not just tired, but spiritually empty. One day, sitting in traffic, he realized he had built a life based on someone else's blueprint. That evening, he sat alone in his garage, surrounded by symbols of success, and felt nothing. That was the beginning. He didn't leave his job the next day. He didn't abandon his relationships overnight. But something in him had shifted, and once it did, he could not unsee the truth. That man eventually walked away from his high-powered role and began mentoring young people in underserved communities. He described the transition not as heroic, but as necessary. I had to disappoint others to stop betraying myself, he said. And in those words, there is a profound truth. Fulfilling a higher role often demands the courage to displease those who only know the previous version of you. To awaken is to disturb, not out of cruelty, but because your presence begins to highlight what others have not yet confronted in themselves. You become a mirror, not by preaching or persuading, but by simply embodying a deeper truth. And that mirror is not always welcome. People will project onto you, some will retreat, others will resist. But amidst the fallout, you will find clarity. You will begin to see who stands beside you because of your light and who stayed only because of your shadow. Growth is rarely convenient. It is not a straight line. It is a series of ruptures and reckonings. The environments you outgrow don't just fade away. They test your loyalty. They whisper to you, stay where it's safe. Don't change too much. Remember who you were. But who you were is not who you are destined to be. And the cost of pretending is the slow erosion of your soul. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is not to run or to fight, but to stay still and grow. Let your expansion be the quiet rebellion. Let your truth unsettle the stagnation. As you step into this larger version of yourself, you will begin to see that many of the structures around you were built to keep you small. And in recognizing that you are not called to destroy those structures for others, but to step beyond them for yourself. There's a story of a young woman who lived her entire life in a small mountain village. Her world was beautiful but limited. Every day she helped her family, worked hard, and honored tradition. But at night she would dream of the ocean. Vast, wild, unknown. She had never seen it, yet it called to her. When she finally gathered the courage to leave, her village elders warned her, "You will be lost out there. You will forget who you are." But she didn't forget. She remembered more than ever. The ocean did not erase her. It expanded her. That is what leaving the familiar does. It does not sever your roots. It strengthens them by showing you where they truly lie. You begin to realize that your sense of home is not tied to a place, but to your own soul. That your belonging is not in conforming, but in expressing the truth you carry within. And yes, it is lonely at first. But then something miraculous happens. You begin to find others who have also left their villages, souls who speak your language, not always with words but with presence. There is a quiet recognition, a shared reverence for the path. These people do not try to fix you or fit you back into a box. They see you because they've seen themselves, and in their presence you feel less alone, not because the world has changed, but because you have found your place in it. So if you find yourself drifting from circles you once cherished, if you feel the ache of misalignment, if you wake up wondering why nothing feels quite right anymore, know this: you are not broken. You are not lost. You are evolving. And evolution often begins with disconnection, not as an end but as a passage, a necessary shedding of skins too tight to hold your becoming. Honor the space between no longer and not yet. It is there, in that sacred in-between, that the soul stretches its wings. And though others may not yet understand your flight, one day they too may feel the stirring of wind beneath their feet. Until then, keep rising. There comes a strange moment in a person's life, one not easily described by logic, when silence becomes more informative than words, when solitude becomes more nourishing than applause. You begin to pull away from distractions that once thrilled you, from conversations that once validated you, from people who once defined you. It is not out of bitterness or fatigue, but because something within you is recalibrating. The outer noise no longer matches the inner pulse. At first, this retreat might appear as depression to the outside world. Friends may wonder if something is wrong. They may reach for explanations, for reasons why you've become quieter, less responsive, less engaged. But what they don't see is the storm beneath the surface, the deep, psychic storm that precedes awakening. You are not breaking down. You are breaking open. In this sacred stage, you begin to feel a gnawing dissatisfaction with surface-level pleasures. The shows you used to binge seem hollow. The small talk feels like static. Even success in the conventional sense loses its glitter. You begin to sense that your previous life, your ambitions, your routines, your identity, was only a fragment of a much larger truth. And in that realization, a quiet grief may set in. Not just for the time lost living half-truths, but for the part of you that believed they were enough. People often think of spiritual transformation as a glowing ascent, but it more often begins as descent. a disintegration of what is false. Like a house that looks sturdy on the outside but has termites in the foundation, much of what we've built in the world begins to tremble. Careers, relationships, beliefs, all of them are summoned for inspection. Not all will survive. That's the terrifying part, but also the liberating one. There was a woman I once knew who had built a life that many envied. A successful business, a handsome partner, luxurious travels. Yet inside she felt like a character in someone else's story. Each day she performed her role with grace, but inside she felt disconnected. From herself, from purpose, from anything real. Then one morning, without warning, she collapsed in her kitchen. No medical explanation could be found. Physically, she was fine. Spiritually, she was drowning. That collapse wasn't a failure. It was a wake-up call. What she learned in the following months through quiet walks, journaling, therapy, and spiritual practice was that she had been living in a persona, a carefully curated identity to meet the world's expectations. Her soul, starved of truth, finally screamed loud enough to shut down her performance. What appeared to others as a breakdown was actually the beginning of her becoming. This is the essence of the third sign, that life begins to feel like it's unraveling, but it's actually reconfiguring. Everything you once clung to starts falling apart, not because you are cursed or punished, but because the universe is inviting you into alignment. The facade must fall so the truth can rise. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes with this stage, not the kind cured by sleep, but the soul-level fatigue from carrying identities that no longer serve you. And so you rest, you withdraw, you stop trying to impress, you stop striving. And in that stillness, uncomfortable as it may be, something profound begins to emerge, your real self. But this is no small task. Our egos are not fond of death, even metaphorical ones. The ego prefers the known, even if it's painful. It will resist transformation at every turn. It will whisper, "Go back. Be who you were. That was safer." It will present evidence, photos, memories, paychecks, compliments, all in an attempt to preserve the illusion. But the soul has a different rhythm. It calls forward. It doesn't negotiate with safety, it demands truth. And so the inner conflict begins, between who you've been and who you're becoming, between the world's voice and your own, between fear and freedom. This is the crucible of transformation. Not everyone survives it. Not everyone is willing to lose what they have for what they might become. But those who do, those who dare to trust the unraveling, are the ones who discover a life that is not only authentic, but sacred. One of the most powerful metaphors for this stage is the caterpillar. When the caterpillar enters the cocoon, it doesn't just grow wings and emerge. It literally dissolves into a formless soup. Its old self must disintegrate entirely. Only then can it reassemble into something new. In that darkness, there is no map, no guarantee. Just surrender. Just trust, and so it is with us. In the unraveling, we are called to let go of certainty, of roles, of everything we thought defined us. And in that terrifying freefall, we find what cannot be taken, our essence, our soul, our truth. This process is not neat or linear. It is messy, often chaotic, but it is honest, and that honesty will become the soil from which your higher purpose grows. Eventually, the world begins to reflect back the change. New people appear, strangers who feel like kin. New opportunities arise, not always more lucrative, but more aligned. And most importantly, you begin to feel peace. Not the peace of everything being perfect, but the peace of finally being in harmony with yourself. So if life feels like it's falling apart, pause before you panic. Look deeper. Ask what's being revealed. Perhaps you are not being punished. Perhaps you are being invited. Invited to release the false. Invited to remember who you are beneath all that conditioning. Invited to rise, not by climbing, but by surrendering. And that surrender, painful as it may be, is the doorway to everything you were meant to become. There is a point along the path of awakening where the most disorienting thing occurs. Not an external catastrophe, not a dramatic upheaval, but a subtle, strange disconnection from what used to move you. It's not depression, it's not boredom, it's something quieter. You walk through your life, among your friends, your work, your familiar patterns, and everything feels distant, like you're walking through a dream that no longer holds your shape. You smile when you're expected to smile. You speak when someone speaks to you, but inside you are watching all of it from somewhere far away. This is the moment when the old self begins to dissolve, not with a bang, but with a whisper. Most people never recognize this stage for what it truly is. They think they're losing their spark, or that they've outgrown their life, which isn't entirely wrong. But what's actually happening is more profound. Your soul is pulling back its energy from what is false. The roles you've played, the identities you've worn, the agreements you made with the world, they begin to unravel. You no longer feel at home in the version of yourself you spent years building. And yet, despite the clarity, there is grief. Real, raw, intimate grief. Not because you've lost something tangible, but because you're losing illusions that once gave you safety. Like a child outgrowing their favorite toy, you must let go of what once comforted you, but can no longer nourish you. This inner dissonance, this feeling of not belonging anywhere, is not a mistake. It is the ache of spiritual shedding. You may find yourself withdrawing from social events that once brought you joy. You may feel strange in your own home, even as nothing has physically changed. Your conversations might feel like echoes of a former self, repetitive, hollow, unfulfilling. What's happening is that the center of gravity within you is shifting. You are no longer orbiting the expectations of others. You are beginning, for perhaps the first time, to hear your own voice in its purest form. This is not a stage of action, but of stillness, of silence. It is like the winter of the soul. Trees do not bloom in winter. They conserve. They go inward. Not because they are dead, but because they are preparing for a deeper life beneath the surface. And so must you. The danger here is the temptation to rush, to fill the emptiness with noise. New relationships, new projects, distractions masquerading as progress. But the transformation you are undergoing is not interested in how quickly you return to motion. It wants you to sit, to be, to listen. Many people mistake this phase for failure. In a culture addicted to productivity, to appearance, to constant motion, stillness is often seen as weakness. But it is the stillness of the seed underground before the bloom. It is the pause before the breath. It is the space where truth grows, not on the surface, but deep in the roots of your being. A man once told me that after years of climbing the corporate ladder, earning promotions, bonuses, and accolades, he woke up one day and could no longer find a reason to go to work. Not because he hated it, not because he was burned out, but because the ladder itself had disappeared. The very thing he had been chasing now seemed like a mirage. He said, "I built a castle, but I never built a home. And now I want something I don't even have words for." This is the turning point, when you want something but don't know what it is. When you ache but can't locate the wound. When you cry and the tears have no story. This is the soul reclaiming its space. It is pulling you away from the noise so you can hear its whisper. And what it whispers is not always comforting. It will not flatter your ego. It will not promise you riches or fame. It will say things like, "Stop pretending," or "This is not your path," or "You've abandoned your truth." Those whispers are sacred. Listen to them. And yet, this listening is not easy, because once you hear them, you cannot unhear them. And once you awaken to the falseness of something, be it a job, a relationship, a belief, you can no longer participate in it with the same enthusiasm. This can lead to deep loneliness. You may feel like a stranger to those around you. You may wonder if you're going crazy, but in reality you are waking up. The loneliness is not a punishment. It is a purification. You are being emptied out so that something true can enter. That truth is not always grand or dramatic. Sometimes it arrives in small, gentle recognitions. Like suddenly knowing you no longer want to argue to be understood, or feeling peace in being alone, or realizing that chasing approval only takes you further from yourself. This phase is the great unraveling, the quiet apocalypse of the ego. And like all apocalypses, it is both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because you do not know who you will be on the other side. Liberating because you are finally letting go of who you were never meant to be. If you are here, if you are in this liminal space between what was and what will be, do not rush. Do not run. Let yourself be remade. Let the silence fill you. Let the discomfort teach you. Let the grief cleanse you. This is not a detour. This is the path. One day you will look back on this time not as the darkest, but as the most honest. You will see that everything you lost was never really yours. You will understand that the loneliness was your soul calling you home. And you will realize that in shedding the mask, in abandoning the performance, you finally met the one person you were always meant to meet, yourself. There comes a point on the path of inner transformation when your external world no longer mirrors your internal reality. You've walked through the valley, you've felt the disintegration of who you thought you were, and now, without even fully realizing it, you've begun to radiate a different energy. Something unnameable has shifted within you. You may not feel stronger or wiser in any obvious way, and yet people begin to respond to you differently, not because you have spoken louder or demanded more, but because the silent architecture of your inner being has changed. This is one of the signs that you are stepping into a higher role than you ever imagined. People begin to look to you, not for validation, not for entertainment, but for guidance, for, quietly, subtly, you become a presence of stability to others. They may not articulate it, but they feel it. They sense in you something grounded, something deeper than words, something unshaken by the chaos of the world. You will notice this in the smallest interactions. A friend confesses their fear to you. A stranger tells you their story in line at the grocery store. A colleague seeks your opinion, not because you're the most experienced, but because your presence makes them feel safe. You didn't ask for this. You didn't apply for the position. But your evolution has made you a lighthouse, and now people steer their ships in your direction without even realizing why. And yet this isn't about becoming anyone's savior or therapist. In fact, the true sign that you are fulfilling a higher role is that you don't seek to fix others anymore. You've come to understand the sacredness of struggle. You've stopped offering bandages for wounds that are meant to awaken. Instead of solving people's problems, you hold space for them to feel. You mirror their light when they forget it's there. You don't impose your wisdom, you embody it. There is a profound difference between teaching from a place of knowing and guiding from a place of being. The former relies on information, technique, and strategy. The latter requires nothing more than presence, and presence cannot be faked. It comes only from the crucible of experience. It is forged in suffering, tested in silence, and born again through surrender. One woman described to me how, after a harrowing divorce and years of loneliness, she no longer felt the need to constantly explain herself to people. She stopped trying to be understood. She said, "I used to want everyone to like me. Now I just want to be real." And in that shift, she became magnetic. People trusted her. They came to her, not because she had answers, but because she made them feel seen. This is what happens when you stop being a performance and start being a presence. You no longer play the roles others assign to you. You no longer shrink yourself to avoid making others uncomfortable. You no longer pretend to be less than what you are. And this authenticity, it changes the field around you. People may not always understand you, but they can't ignore you. Your energy becomes unmistakable, not because it's loud, but because it's clear. But here's the paradox. As more people are drawn to your clarity, you may begin to feel more isolated. Not because you are alone, but because fewer people truly understand the depth of the inner work you've done. It's not that you're better than anyone. This is not a hierarchy. It's that you've tasted silence. You've walked through your own shadows, and you've come out carrying a torch. And not everyone is ready to sit in the fire with you. Still, you don't judge them. In fact, One of the clearest signs that you are embodying a higher role is that your compassion deepens, even as your boundaries become firmer. You understand that love without limits becomes self-destruction, and that wisdom without compassion becomes arrogance. You no longer overextend yourself to be liked. You serve from overflow, not depletion. You say no without guilt. You love without clinging. This evolution is quiet, but its effects are seismic. It transforms how you walk into a room, how you listen, how you breathe, how you stand up for yourself, not with anger but with calm certainty. Your confidence no longer depends on outcomes. Your peace is no longer held hostage by approval. You may still feel fear, but you are no longer ruled by it. You may still feel pain, but you no longer run from it. You've made room inside yourself for the full spectrum of the human experience. And that, perhaps, is the ultimate sign that you are stepping into a greater role than you imagined. You have become a vessel large enough to hold joy and sorrow, clarity and confusion, strength and tenderness, all without collapsing. You no longer seek to escape your humanity. You've embraced it as the path to the divine. In practical terms, this shift shows up in small, human ways. You speak more slowly. You pause before reacting. You notice when someone is speaking from their wounds rather than their wisdom. You hold a child's gaze longer. You sit with the elderly without rushing the moment. You write with more intention. You listen without waiting to speak. You live from your soul, not your ego, and you begin to notice the ripple effects. A younger friend tells you that your calm during their crisis helped them breathe. A sibling confesses that something you said years ago changed the way they look at life. A coworker admits that your presence at work makes things feel less chaotic, and none of this feels like praise. It feels like confirmation that your pain had purpose, that your solitude was sacred, that your healing wasn't just for you. Because when you step into your higher role, it's never about titles or platforms or applause. It's about becoming who you were always meant to be beneath the layers of conditioning. It's about returning to the original self, the one that existed before the world told you who to be. And in that return, you become a mirror for others. Not by telling them where to go, but by standing so fully in your own truth that they remember their own. That's what it means to fulfill a higher role. Not to rise above the world, but to go so deeply into your own life that others find their way through yours. One of the most profound signs that you are fulfilling a higher role than you imagined is that life begins to shape itself around your presence, not your performance. You no longer chase purpose with desperation. It begins to unfold through you naturally, silently, like a tree growing in the forest, not asking for applause but becoming undeniable all the same. You realize that the more you surrender to your authenticity, the more the right people, the right situations, and the right timing find you, not because you've manipulated them into being, but because you've stopped resisting your inner alignment. You become like water, flowing, flexible, yet deeply powerful. And in this surrendered state, you stop measuring yourself by external benchmarks, success, approval, validation, and instead become guided by something much older, something primal and eternal, something within. At first, this shift is subtle. You may find yourself suddenly uninterested in certain conversations, disenchanted by shallow pursuits, or exhausted by the effort it takes to maintain an image. You no longer feel the urge to impress others or even to explain yourself. The constant performance of identity begins to dissolve. What remains is not a hollow space, but an inner stillness, and from that stillness comes truth. Not the kind you shout, but the kind you live. This is not to say the journey becomes easy. In fact, it may feel lonelier before it feels freer. The world is still oriented around masks and mirrors, but you begin to notice something else. Synchronicities. Quiet affirmations from life itself that you are on the right path. A book falls into your hands that speaks directly to your situation. A stranger says exactly what you needed to hear. A door opens at just the right moment. These are not coincidences. They are confirmations. There's an old saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. But there's a deeper truth beneath that. When you become the teacher of your own soul, life itself becomes your student. Your thoughts, your feelings, your reactions, your silence, they all ripple outward. And slowly, without your needing to control or calculate it, your influence grows. Not in grand gestures, but in deep impressions. You start to change the environment just by being in it. Not because you're trying to lead, but because your integrity quietly demands it. In this state, your inner world becomes your compass. You feel the tension in your body when something is off. You sense the misalignment when someone's words don't match their energy. You trust your intuition over logic when the two disagree. This isn't magical thinking, it's embodiment. It's the result of having listened to yourself so long that your entire system has become intelligent, alert, responsive. You see, the real power of fulfilling a higher role isn't about influence or leadership. It's about congruence. The alignment between your inner truth and your outer actions. When those two become one, you generate a field of coherence around you. And coherence is healing. People sense it even if they don't understand it. It feels like safety. It feels like home. Think of the times you've been around someone who made you feel completely accepted without effort. They may not have said much. They may have just listened or smiled or sat with you in silence. And yet, in their presence, you felt more yourself than you had in a long time. That's the effect of a coherent soul. That's the role you now begin to fulfill, not through striving, but through being. Ironically, the more inward your focus becomes, the more outward your impact expands. You might notice people around you becoming more reflective. You might observe relationships deepening without force. Children may feel safer around you. Animals may be drawn to you. Nature may feel more alive in your presence. All of this is evidence not of spiritual superiority but of soulful integration. You've become a tuning fork for truth and the world responds accordingly. And yet, your ego becomes quieter. You don't need recognition because your reward is the peace you carry. You don't need titles because your essence is enough. You don't need constant connection because your solitude is nourishing. You've transcended the hunger for external confirmation, not by rejecting the world, but by embodying your part in it more fully than ever before. A man once told me that after a traumatic collapse in his life, divorce, bankruptcy, isolation, he found himself sitting by a lake one morning, watching the sunrise. There was no epiphany, no dramatic breakthrough. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to become anyone else. He said, "I realized I was already who I had been trying to be." That moment of realization didn't change the world, but it changed his world. And eventually, that peace began to change others as well. His children, his friendships, his work. Not because he taught peace, but because he became it. This is the hidden truth of spiritual responsibility. When you become whole, others remember their own wholeness. When you stop performing, others feel permission to drop their masks. When you speak from your soul, others hear theirs more clearly. And none of this requires effort. It only requires presence. That is what it means to live a life of sacred influence. Of course, the world may not always reward this role in obvious ways. There will still be resistance, misunderstandings, even projections. Some will envy your stillness because it reflects their inner chaos. Others will test your boundaries, unconsciously hoping you'll show them theirs. But through it all, you remain rooted, not because you are unfeeling, but because you felt so deeply that nothing can uproot you anymore. The path of inner transformation eventually becomes a path of service, not through duty, but through natural overflow. You give not because you lack, but because you've become a well that never runs dry. You speak truth, not because you want to be right, but because you are no longer willing to betray your soul. You walk gently, because you've learned how much pain people carry invisibly, and you love fiercely because you know what it's like to live unloved. And so you fulfill a role higher than you imagined, not because you've risen above others, but because you've descended into the depths of your own being and returned with something real, something timeless, something unshakable. You've become a living reminder that it is possible to survive this world and still remain intact, that it is possible to lose everything and still find your center, that it is possible to live a life of depth, presence, and meaning, even if no one sees it, even if no one names it. Because your life is no longer about appearances, it's about alignment, and in that alignment, you become a quiet revolution in a world full of noise.